Do you like sports? Do you like art? What about science? Giraffes? Giraffe scientists that paint rugby games? It's all available on Audible, the biggest audiobook site with the largest selection of audiobooks this side of the inner solar system. No need to use your boring old eyes anymore. The ears are the future, my friend. Why, you're using them right now. So check out Audible and get your listen on. Go to www.readlearnlivepodcast.com/audible to start your 30-day free trial today.
So you have all these tools, mindfulness, meditation, things we use to sort of try to wake ourselves up. But the basic fact of the matter is that we're not conscious in the way that our ancestors were conscious because we're not sleeping in the right way.
Hello and welcome to Read, Learn, Live, the podcast about improving yourself through literature. I'm your acclaimed host, John Monaster, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 55, the only palindrome for the next few weeks. As always, if you have ideas for books you'd like to see featured, or of authors you want to put me in touch with, you can reach me at jon@readlearnlivepodcast.com. Today, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak with author Clark Strand about his book, Waking Up in the Dark, Ancient Wisdom for a Sleepless Age. Clark Strand is the author of Waking Up to the Dark and co-author with his wife Perdita Finn of The Way of the Rose, The Radical Path of the Divine Feminine Hidden in the Rosary. Strand has written for Wall Street Journal, The New York Times, The Washington Post, Huffington Post, Salon, and numerous other newspaper and online venues. He is the co-founder of Way of the Rose, an international eco-feminist rosary fellowship open to people of any spiritual background. He lives in the Catskill Mountains with his wife and family. I hope you enjoy our conversation as much as I did. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Read, Learn, Live podcast. I am your host, John Monaster. I am hoping you have a wonderful day ahead of you and behind you today. I am so excited to be here with Clark Strand, author of Waking Up to the Dark. Clark, say hello.
Hi, everybody.
Hey, Clark, thanks for joining. It's good to have you on. This book, we'll get into it. This book was so interesting. It raised so many fundamental questions about who we are and how we live that I found fascinating. So I'm really, really excited to talk about it. But I kind of always like to start off with just having a brief summary in the author's own words. So just tell us in your mind what this book is about.
Well, I guess Waking Up to the Dark is a mix of memoir, science writing, paleoanthropology, ecology, and what I guess I would call is kind of a paleo spirituality. An attempt to reach back before history and to figure out what was the sort of spiritual state of mind and spiritual practice of people before we began to live in large groups and began to build the kind of consensus that leads to civilization and more sort of rigorously ordered and controlled ways of living.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is absolutely fascinating to me, right? And it's definitely something that we don't often stop to consider. We live in our culture, we live our lives, and we don't often think about like I live in New York City, kind of looking outside and imagining what it looked like before the city was there. And who was living there and what that must have been like. So I think that's a useful thing to do from time to time.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you a couple quick questions about your creative process before we really delve into the book. And I like to start off with just, kind of being curious about what made you decide you really had to write this book, this particular book right now. You've written other books, you've thought a lot about many things. What brought you to the point of saying, okay, I'm going to write all this down, I'm going to collect everything, and I have to write this particular book?
Yeah. Well, in an odd kind of way, the best way to answer that question is sort of start at the end of the book and work your way forward.
Yeah.
The entire book, the first 3/4 of it at least, which accounts for about 95% of the book, is really a kind of an extended introduction to prepare the reader to read the last 3 pages, which are not written by me. And so it's an odd book in that respect. There's this piece of writing that comes at the very end, the Gospel according to the Dark, which is only 3 pages long. But in order to understand what you're reading, when you read that piece of writing, you really need all of the paleoanthropology and deep history and discussions about sleep and waking in the middle of the night and discussions of prolactin and other kinds of sleep-related hormones and things like that in order to really sort of grasp what you're reading when you get to the end of it. So I wrote the book in order to explain those 3 pages, or at least to set them up properly. I'm not sure anybody can explain them. It's basically a kind of an almost apocalyptic sort of gospel spoken in the voice of a figure that I call in the book the Black Madonna. And so the book is really, I wrote the book to do that, to be able to present those last 3 pages to the general reader. But it was a tricky thing to do. I mean, how exactly do you present for the modern reader what amounts to a modern Marian apparition outside of the Catholic Church, spoken in the voice of a figure who has no interest whatsoever in Catholicism or even religion, but is deeply concerned with ecology, the state of the planet, and planetary life. And so that breaks set on so many different levels and from so many different angles that the modern reader hardly even knows where to begin. So the whole book was a way of kind of setting up that experience.
Yeah, I hadn't realized that. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
really interesting.
yeah.
So that it must have been very difficult. So how did you go about doing that? What was your process to kind of organize all the subject that you covered? Since, like you said, you did cover all these different areas.
Yeah.
Like from hormones to science studies and all this stuff. How did you decide to put all that together?
Well, I discovered, and I think, having spoken with you a little bit about the range of this discussion and looked at your questions, I think that the best way of thinking of it is that I had to tell my own story, right, in order to introduce this figure and her message. But I also had to tell the story of my species. So I had to discuss the deep history of human beings, how we got to where we are today, where we stand in evolutionary history, and so I had to tell both stories: the story, my own personal story, and the story of our species, and had to retell it in a way that that makes sense, I think, of climate change and species extinction. I mean, most of the human narratives that we're given don't interact with species extinction or climate change. The story of civilization is kind of anathema to, and vice versa, to trends that large and that global. So, my process was that I kept a series of 59 pocket notebooks that I wrote in over a period of years. I would get up to wake up and go for a walk in the middle of the night, and I would come back and frequently would write a paragraph or two before going to bed. Sometimes I would actually stop and write, if the moon were bright enough to see, I'd stop and actually write on my walks. And then I took all of those notebooks finally once I decided that I, needed to sort of, come clean about all of this and report it, At one point, the figure that I referred to as the Black Madonna, I thought, well, what am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to go to the local bishop like some, Portuguese peasant girl, and tell my story, right? And I'm not Catholic and not even Christian or religious. So that seemed sort of off the table. And she said, no, the editors are the bishops now. So you're to write a book. So once I realized that that was the task before me and that's what I had to do, I took all these notebooks about my experiences of waking in the middle of the night and the various feature articles I'd written about segmented sleep and sleep studies, paleoanthropology, and so forth and so on. And I mixed them together with these notebooks, and I gave them to my wife, who's a brilliant book editor. and she basically organized the writing into the shape of a book because I really had no idea how to put this particular book together. Sometimes I have an outline or have an idea for how I want to organize it, but it wasn't clear how exactly to put this book together. And she wove it like a tapestry,
Oh,
and
wow.
created the book that that you have in your hands.
Oh, that's great. That must have been wonderful to be able to collaborate with someone like that and have someone like that to help you translate what you had done.
We've always helped one another with our writing. We just wrote a book called "The Way of the Rose," the radical path of the divine feminine hidden in the rosary, and we worked on that book together, co-wrote it. But we work all of our writing together. So our books typically have just one of our names on it, but the other has been intimately involved in its production nearly always.
Sure. Well, yeah. Okay. Well, let's get into the book now that we've tiptoed around it, because there's a lot to talk about.
Yeah.
I think maybe just to start off with, since this was part memoir, like you mentioned, maybe just start off talking about your childhood a bit. What was your childhood like, and how did that affect your relationship to the light that you talk about?
Yeah. Well, I grew up down south in the 50s and 60s, in areas that were ranged from, I guess, rural to suburban. And much of my time was spent in rural areas where there wasn't a great deal of ambient artificial light. And so, I think the tendency also was to put children to bed not that long after sundown. So, I was the first child and my parents were probably tired. So he put me to bed. And I would, follow the natural pattern for human beings when they're not, saturated with artificial light. And I would wake after 4 hours and be lying awake in bed. And I think when I was very young, I would just sort of daydream or whatever. I wouldn't get up and move around. But at a certain point, I started to get a little restless. I think about 8 or 9 years old. And I had spent a tremendous amount of time outdoors. This was a kinder, gentler era. There was no, sort of ambient fear drifting through the culture, about child abductions and all this sort of stuff. There were no CSI Miami shows.
Hmm.
It was just, the assumption was that, the world was a somewhat, gentler place. And so I was never afraid to go outside at night. I would get up and I would slip out the door. There was a golf course a block or two away, and I would wander around in the middle of the night, starting around age, 8 or 9 years old. And I've done that my whole life. Um, I experienced the darkness as a wonderful thing, sort of a magical time. And it took a long time to realize the obvious, which was I was the only one out there. Someone asked me, weren't you afraid of criminals? And I said, no, I never thought about criminals, but I never saw anyone when I was walking
Right.
anyway. Occasionally a police car would drive by and I would, as a child, I had the sense that, what I was doing was a little, eccentric perhaps, or not strictly speaking condoned or allowed. So I would, step off into the shadows, and sort of disappear. But I never saw anyone else out wandering around at 2 or 3 a.m. So
Right.
one night,
Yeah.
one night I came home and my mother caught me for whatever reason.
Mm.
She was up, and I walked in and I pretended to be sleepwalking, and, and I was wearing shoes, right?
You did the whole thing. Yeah.
But she bought it, or it may also be that she was just, the alternative was her son was engaged in some weird antisocial behavior she
Right.
couldn't
Just
call,
wandering.
just
Or,
wandering around the middle of the night,
or
so
maybe she
we
knew
never
and she was
questioned it.
okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
maybe.
Moms are pretty smart, I've
Yeah,
found. Um, that's really interesting. I mean, to think about how at such a young age that was already your relationship,
yeah,
with the nighttime, and that really set the stage for your entire life. It sounds like.
yeah. I mean, I think I'm an outlier a bit in that respect. I mean, even in times when, I've been in urban settings and in areas where there's a lot more artificial light and it's harder to get away from it, I have still tended to wake in the middle of the night. And so for whatever reason, I have maybe a slightly older version of human endocrinology working in my body,
Mm,
so that I don't follow sort of natural patterns. But even so, human beings, that pattern is still there. Um, I
Yeah.
think you probably know from the book that in the 1990s, there was a researcher at the National Institutes of Mental Health, Thomas Ware. He was a guy who discovered circadian rhythms, right, and seasonal affective disorder. So he was a heavy hitter in the world of photosensitivity and sleep research. Anyway, he got curious about human sleep patterns, and he had seen references to segmented sleep, as recently as 2 centuries ago, people waking up in the middle of the night and then going back to sleep. So he became curious about the paleobiology of sleep. And he thought, well, human consolidated sleep, meaning, consolidated into 8-hour blocks, convenient 8-hour sleep blocks like convenient 8-hour work blocks. We tended to compress and consolidate our sleep as modern people since the Industrial Revolution. So he thought, well, maybe the impulse to wake in the middle of the night is still encoded in
Hmm.
in our genes. So he took people off the street, ordinary people, and he took them off all forms of electric lighting for 1 month. And after 3 weeks of making up what he called the national sleep deficit, right?
Yeah.
The fact that everybody gets too little sleep. After 3 weeks of sleeping for an hour or two more, every single person in the study began to wake up after 4 hours into a quiescent sort of state of mind for 2 hours where they were awake but very deeply calm and where they felt very much at peace. And then they would sleep for another 4 hours and they would get up. Everybody in the study. So if you know anything at all about research in human subjects, you know that 100% results that agree 100% with every subject are fairly rare. I mean, there are
Right.
normally some outliers, but every subject was the same way. And the study's since been replicated, and this is what happens. So that impulse to wake after 4 hours is just encoded in our genes. Even now, all modern light has done, modern artificial lighting has done is suppress that impulse, right? And we stay up so late that we just naturally have to sleep for 8 hours straight. So light is the most powerful stimulant the world's ever known, and that's how it functions. So, but as you get older and your metabolic force, your metabolic power begins to weaken, it's harder to override that biological imperative for
Hmm.
segmented sleep. And that's the reason why, as people get older, they experience what sleep specialists call sleep fragmentation, which is then medicated oftentimes by the pharmaceutical industry. But it's a big scam because this isn't a pathology. This is the natural pattern of sleep, which older people are reverting to as they find themselves unable to sort of toe the line of cultural, light assisted wakefulness.
Right. Well, I mean, and what's interesting is that like a lot of the book you devote to talking about how we've done this culturally assisted sleep
Right,
setup, and as such, we're missing out on the value of darkness. Like there's like we've sort of forgotten that darkness actually is good and good can come from it, and we shouldn't be afraid of it.
right.
And you specifically wrote that we didn't even know the value of it till we destroyed it. So
Yeah,
so what is the value of darkness? What is the goodness of it? And what have we lost by sort of pushing it away with artificial light?
right. Well, there are a lot of different ways of looking at that. One is just purely biological. We need darkness, in order to function properly as biological beings. The need for rest, the need for deep sleep and release and relaxation, the natural healing processes of our body require darkness. Loss of sleep is, and loss of darkness is a major cause of cancer. The people who create lab rats for experiments, they discovered, I think 15, 20 years ago, that the rats that they were creating were already predisposed towards cancer when they sent them out to the labs for use in testing because they were exposed to too much artificial light.
Mm.
And so they began to reduce the amount of artificial light that they were exposed to after dark and keep them in completely dark rooms. And they found that even like a monitor light, like a little blinking blue or red light or something like that in the corner of the place where they were being kept, would oftentimes affect their predisposition statistically towards cancer.
Mm.
So this is, so imagine, what we're doing to ourselves as we, are staring at our screens in the middle of the night and, uh, basically burning the candle at both ends, quite literally, so that very, very little darkness is left over in our lives. So that's just biologically alone, there's value and health and wholesomeness in the dark. But beyond that, our spiritual nature, I think, comes alive and comes awake in a way that we don't tend to experience by light,
Mm.
but during by daylight. Many of the great scriptures of the world were composed during the dark, like the legend has it that the David, the author of the Psalms, hung a harp over his bed near the window with little, sort of like a little mobile or little trinkets hanging from it. So when the wind blew across it, it would wake him to
Mm.
pray and to compose the Psalms. The Buddha gets enlightened in the story of the Buddha's enlightenment. That happens between 2 and 4 a.m. Jesus is always going off into the hills to pray in the middle of the night. Muhammad writes much of the Quran, receives it from the angel Jibril in the middle of the night or in a cave in a dark setting. Moses is enshrouded by a cloud at the top of Mount Sinai, and the list goes on and on. So there's this sense that our connection with the world of spirit is dependent upon the numinous, the dark, the vague, the misty, areas where things, the borders between things aren't quite so sharply defined.
Mhm.
And I think that there's this prejudice that we feel as modern people living in a light saturated, billion watt culture. There's a prejudice that I think, are completely unaware of, but which guides a great deal of our behavior. And that is the belief that everything can be made clear. Everything should be made clear. Everything should be classified. Everything should be known. But these are all byproducts of light assisted ways of thinking and behaving. The darkness teaches us that we can't know everything, or we can't know it just with our heads. We can only know certain things with our hearts, with our feet, right, with our bodies. There are all other kinds of ways of knowing. And our modern way of living has tended to, obliterate all forms of knowing, but essentially the visual. We're very, very visual, light sensitive, light oriented creatures at this point, and we weren't always that way.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think what you were talking about towards the end of that really connects with my next question, which is you have this lovely passage where you write, because we no longer honor the darkness, we've lost touch with the journey of the soul.
Yeah.
And it sounds like maybe in some of these other religious people that were writing these kind of religious texts, maybe they were on their own journeys. So
Yeah.
in your mind, what is this journey of the soul? What have we lost touch with?
Well, I think the journey of the soul is the long story of ourselves as individuals passing through multiple incarnations and through countless bodies over millions of years, and the journey of our species as well through deep time. I think that the journey of the soul is a very, very long journey. It's not just the sort of I don't know, conventional Christian idea of the journey through this life, right? And then on to heaven or hell. It's a very simple minded, very spiritually degraded idea of both of the soul and the soul's journey. Religious people will tell you the soul's immortal, but mostly what that means is, you either live forever in hell or live forever in heaven. They don't tell you anything about before this life, right?
Hmm.
If the soul is immortal, what was it doing before it got here, right?
Yeah.
But if you look at ecology and you look at nature, you realize that one thing flows into another. Nothing is wasted, nothing is added, nothing is lost, right? It's all one unitary system with many cells or many parts. And we're a part of that, an integral part of that. And we participate, I think, spiritually and biologically in this sort of endless matrix of blessings that goes back to the beginning of life on this planet. And so we've lost touch with our bodies and we've lost touch with our souls. And I think specifically, we've lost touch with the way in which our souls inhabit our bodies, right? We become
Hmm.
very top heavy, become sort of stuck in our heads, both as individuals and collectively as a civilization and as a species. We think that we think that what we think is all important. We think we are all important. We don't really see the rest of nature, don't really relate to it, don't see ourselves as being a part of it.
Yeah, I think that's a really useful point to keep in mind, and one that I totally agree with. And you mentioned that this sort of separation happened at a particular moment, and I think one of the things you zero in on is the invention of fire
Yeah,
specifically, and then you have a really fascinating discussion about tying that to fertility rates and the human population explosion and kind of everything that happened from there, where we really did start to separate ourselves from
right,
nature. So
right,
I'd love to hear more about kind of how things changed once fire was invented.
right. Well, it was a very, very slow, gradual process, and I don't mean to suggest, that human beings shouldn't have had fire or anything quite
Yeah.
that extreme. I mean, basically, I think we had fire before we were identifiably human, by modern standards, modern ways of looking at the human. We've had fire for a very long time, but it started a process. It was like lighting a very, very long fuse
Hmm.
towards a bomb that would eventually go off in the 20th century, a population bomb. But it got its start there. What happened was when human beings began to bring fire into their dwellings. They didn't live in caves ever, because caves were not a good place to have a fire. You asphyxiate. So, but they lived in the mouths of caves or in these little rocky outcrops, right? Sort of rock shelters, they're called. And they lived there and sometimes under hides or skins if they were nomadic or traveling, or even under dense forest trees. And when the sun went down, it was dark. And they would, snuggle, make love, feed the nurse children, but they would basically all be together until the sun came up. But at a certain point, when they began to use fire to cook their food and provide light after dark, then you begin to see here, I think, the rudiments of human culture, storytelling, dance, acting out, certain early forms of song and the development of language, as a result of this sort of together time in the dark, where there really wasn't any productive work that could be done. There wasn't really enough light for that, right? So it sort of lent itself to culture, as it were. And but when they did that, what happened was they were telling their bodies, which have photoreceptor cells all over them, not just the eyes, right? The cells of the skin, right? Everything is sensitive to light. They were telling their bodies that the days were longer. And back in those days, we're talking the Paleolithic. Uh, at that time, human beings were really only fertile. Women were only fertile in late summer because this was the only time that their body fat was. They had enough body. Their body index, fat to muscle ratio was such
Hmm.
that they were really able to conceive, and so Children would be conceived in August, and when or July or August, when the days were very, very long, and there were a lot of carbohydrates to ingest, right? And then they would give birth. That they would build up their body weight, their body fat, and then they could make it through the winter, and then give birth in late winter, early spring. And this was sort of the natural pattern. But when they began to bring fire inside of their caves, they began to sort of trick their bodies into believing that the days were getting longer. And in the beginning, this probably didn't affect human population that greatly, but as time went on and sources of light got brighter and brighter, and especially when they became sedentary and began to build houses and structures, then the power of that illumination was to extend human fertility to year round. Once women were able to conceive any time of year, because they had at that point they were farming, doing early agriculture, creating grains to eat all year round. Once they had enough carbohydrates to keep their weight up year round, they conceived year round. The human population began to grow. And the demands of agriculture were such that you needed more people to farm because it was very, very hard work. And so thus began this sort of endless cycle of graining and growing. Okay. The more grain you've got, the more population you've got, the higher your population, the more grain you need. And it goes on and on and on. And finally, that meets the petroleum age with petrochemical fertilizers and modern methods of farming. And suddenly you've got a human population that's doubling every few years. And, at this point, it's the biggest ecological problem on the planet today is not actually hydrocarbons, but it's human population. The fewer people, the more people you have, the more commerce you have, the more need for transportation. The bottom line is human population. That has everything to do with light.
Yeah, that's a really interesting connection that you draw all the way, it makes a lot of sense, especially thinking about what happened in the 20th century. And you have a great graph in the book showing our kind of population over time and how the last even the last 20, 30 years, those numbers have gone up
Yeah.
a ton. So it's really happening. Yeah. I do want to be sure and mention, I think Rabbi Nachman, is that?
Yes. Uh-huh.
See, this figure you really took a lot of inspiration from, and you talked a bit about him in the book. So I just wanted to check in on that and learn a little bit about who he was, how you found him, and what use his work was to you.
Right. Well, funny story. I had a friend years and years ago who's that's where he used to call him the New Age rabbi, right? He was not actually a rabbi, but he was Reformed. He was a Zen Buddhist practitioner, but also a fairly devoted member of his local Reformed Jewish synagogue, and he had studied the writings of a number of the sort of green rabbis to emerge, toward the 1980s and 90s and the noughts. There was this group of Jewish thinkers who were beginning to think ecologically about the Torah and about the Jewish teachings and to try to find some sort of ecological sanity in those old writings, right? And so Arthur Waskow, Arthur Green, a number of these people. Anyway, my friend said, you really ought to read Reb Nachman of Breslov because he woke up in the middle of the night like you, and he based his entire approach to Hasidic Judaism on waking for this practice he called Hitbodedut, or seeking out solitary conversation with God. And so I bought this little book called Outpouring of the Soul. And it described this practice, very ancient Jewish practice, tikkun hazot, of cutting the night in two, or basically bisected sleep, waking after 4 hours of sleep for an hour or two of prayer. And that was sort of the entry point for me. I'd been doing this all my life, And even when I was a Zen Buddhist monk, I would get up in the middle of the night and go wander in the graveyard and maybe meditate or chant a little bit out there in the mountains. But I had no idea that this was an actual religious practice or that it had any history. I hadn't read Thomas Ware at that point. I didn't know anything about the paleobiology of sleep or segmented sleep. So Reb Nachman was the first person religious figure I read who wrote about this. And his writings were filled with references to the first and second sleep and waking to go out into the woods and speak to God in your own language, just sort of spontaneous prayer. And so I tried that. I wasn't a believer in the same way that Reb Nachman was, but I had certainly spent a lot of time outside in the dark. So I began to, sort of trend my practice in that direction. This was about 15 years ago. And so the further I got into it, the more I discovered that there was a wealth of Jewish writings on this, what I call in the book, The Hour of God. Once I realized that, I began to get curious. I said, well, does it exist in other traditions? Mm-hmm. Well, it turned out it did. I corresponded with novice masters in Carthusian monasteries, Catholic monasteries. I corresponded with imams, in the Muslim tradition, people who are practicing what's called tahajjud, which is the Muslim version of that prayer. I discovered Ushitoro Gongyo in the Buddhist tradition, the head priest at Nichiren temples getting up in the middle of the night to chant. And what I discovered was that not only was the practice universal, but it was happening at exactly the same time all over the world, usually between two. I say 2 to 4 a.m. because we're very number-oriented people. We moderns.
Yeah.
They didn't describe it that way. Like in the old texts, the ancient Jewish texts, they say that tikkun hazot, which means to cut the night in two, begins 6 hours after sunset, whatever the time of year. So that'll be that the hour of God basically will begin, at different times. Sometimes, in the wintertime, it'll begin at midnight, right?
Yeah.
And but in the summer it'll start later. But it's the same pattern, and I found that this pattern existed and it was universal across all religious traditions. There weren't many religious traditions that were still doing it in the modern age, like this Carthusian novice master I knew. His is one of the very last Christian religious orders in the world to preserve this practice. And the Reb Nachman, who founded the Breslauer Jewish Hasidic community, the Breslavers, most of them don't do it, but a few do. But they're the only Jews that do it anymore, for the most part. And it still exists here and there, and it exists in hunter-gatherer cultures today. But those are the quickly disappearing outliers. Mostly it's become extinct, but it's still there. It's encoded within us. We can reawaken it, but it behaviorally it doesn't exist.
Yeah, and I think that's so interesting that it's something that our society has sort of pushed aside with artificial light, just generally, amongst maybe non-religious people. And then everything you were just saying, it seems like even those religions that had this long-standing practice of doing that, they've also moved away from that. So it seems like it's just really everybody. And I think this kind of brings me to the next thing I wanted to talk to you about, which was, you make this excellent point and theorize basically at this point we're addicted to artificial light.
Yeah.
And that this artificial light has profoundly changed us, and that makes a lot of sense. If we're seeing that that's happening both from non-religious and religious groups, it's really affecting everybody across the spectrum. And I think it would be great to hear a little bit more about that and maybe tie in some of the, for instance, hormonal changes that you had mentioned earlier, and really trying to understand what the artificial light has done to us and what's going to happen going forward.
Right. Well, one of the things that Weir discovered was, Thomas Weir, the researcher at the National Institute of Mental Health.
Yeah.
One of the things that he discovered was that these 2 hours in the middle of the night that people were waking up for, they had an endocrinology that was unique, and it wasn't like the hormonal uh, profile of these people
Hmm.
did not conform to what he understood of waking or sleeping consciousness. Right?
Hmm.
It was its own state. It was its own hormonal condition, which had not really been identified by modern neuroscientists, right? People who study neurochemicals. And so what he did was, he took blood. He did tests on these people, and he discovered that what was happening was that their levels of prolactin were remaining at elevated levels even though they were awake. Now, prolactin has been called the attachment hormone because it is the hormone that rises in nursing mothers. Mothers, when their milk lets down, the prolactin levels rise, and it keeps them very relaxed and still and tranquil. It rises in the babies who are nursing. It even rises in the fathers who are watching nursing, right?
Hmm.
This is a very natural response to keep everybody calm. Prolactin is the hormone that reaches elevated levels in birds that are roosting on their nests, right? And it also the hormone that keeps us still while we're asleep, so that we remain tranquil, right? And our bodies can rest. So it is this it's this hormone that produces a very quiet state of body and mind, right? Deep quiet. Well, the assumption, I think, has been that this creates a kind of a drowsy state, perhaps, or a very relaxed state. But nobody really kind of understood that you could be wide awake and have high prolactin levels, because this never really happens. Like if you wake up in the middle of the night, like if you're going to bed at midnight, right? You're staying up or after midnight and then getting up at 6 o'clock in the morning. If you wake up in the middle of the night, your prolactin levels will fall immediately, right? Especially if
Hmm.
you turn on the lights, because your body isn't getting the full spectrum of darkness that it needs in order to produce this sort of magical hour of God. However, if you take yourself off of artificial lighting, or you go to bed earlier and turn off the lights and give yourself, 10 hours to work with every night in the dark, then what you will experience is you'll go to sleep for 4 hours, and then this kind of invisible switch gets thrown and you wake, but your prolactin levels don't fall. They stay at sleep levels, but you're awake.
Hmm.
So in the Song of Songs, the lover says, "I sleep, but my heart is awake." Right. So here's a record from this very ancient text that describes this state of mind. This is not a religious teaching. This is, I mean, it's a love poem, an erotic love poem. So I think it's consistent with this sort of waking in the middle of the night.
Yeah.
But it's describing an actual state of body and mind. I mean, these people were describing a state that was very familiar to them, right? When people heard this poem 2,000 years ago, they recognized, "I sleep but my heart is awake." Everybody knew what that was. Everybody knew what that felt like. You're awake to something that is deeper and older than you are, right? You're
Hmm.
awake to, I guess you say, your true nature, or the true nature of things, right? And so you're awake to the world of the spirit. And people, reported having dreams and visions during this time. A lot of the spiritual texts of the world were probably written during this time, right? People would get up and, or they would channel something, or something would come through them and they write it down later, or commit it to memory and they report it in the morning. People would often wake and remember dreams, and they would take guidance from what they experienced during this time. Anyway, Ware discovered this, and he was quite shocked by it. He had no idea he was going to discover anything quite so significant. I mean, by the end of the study, he's beginning to sound more like a Jungian analyst than a paleobiologist. He's beginning to speak of like a lost channel of numinous awareness and things like that. Not the kind of not what you normally expect from a sleep researcher. But he was really, I think, kind of converted by the experience of making this discovery. Anyway, one of the strange effects of this was that when he asked people at the end of the study, the initial study, to report on how they felt, everyone in the study said the same thing. They said, I feel like I am awake for the first time in my life.
Mm.
And he thought that was an odd thing. Well, is it because they're getting enough sleep finally? Or is it because they're getting the right kind of sleep? Is it because the experience of this numinous channel, the reopening of this numinous channel in the middle of the night, between the sort of the world of the spirit, and the material world, between the land of the ancestors, whatever it is this the cause of it? I mean, but then the sort of scientist part of his brain kicked back in. And he said, well, wait a minute. Are they really more awake, or do they think they're more awake? So he got on the phone with a friend of his who studies wakefulness, right? So Ware studies sleep, his friend studies wakefulness. Is there a test that you can give people to see how awake they actually are? Turns out there is. So he administered this test to his subjects to see if they really were more awake. Not only were they more awake than ordinary human beings, they were more awake than fighter pilots.
Mm.
Okay? So we're talking about a level of functioning that ordinary people reach, right, in terms of their awareness, their consciousness. We're talking about a level of functioning that people reach after 1 month taking off artificial light that no one in the culture is experiencing today. So we have presidents, not that our current president is someone to compare, that role to. We've had presidents for the past 50, 60, 70, 80 years who aren't awake. We've got brain surgeons who aren't awake. We've got senators, teachers, just the average person driving down the road is not completely awake. Not as awake as human beings are supposed to be. Not as awake as human beings have been in the past. So we have all these tools, mindfulness, meditation, things we use to sort of try to wake ourselves up. But the basic fact of the matter is that we're not conscious in the way that our ancestors were conscious, because we're not sleeping in the right way.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Read, Learn, Live. If you liked it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. If you hated it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. And so it goes.